Jerusalem, nearly 2,000 years ago. Outside the city walls, on a hill used for Roman executions, a small group of soldiers were carrying out what must have seemed like an ordinary assignment. They had done this before. Prisoners were stripped, nails were prepared, crosses were raised, and the soldiers waited for the condemned to die. To Rome, crucifixion was not sacred, it was punishment. A public warning designed to show what happened to anyone who challenged Roman authority. But one execution that day would become unlike any other. The prisoner was Jesus of Nazareth, and standing beneath his cross were Roman soldiers whose names history never recorded. One of them may have driven the nails, another guarded the site, others divided Jesus' clothing. And according to the gospel accounts, a Roman centurion watched the entire execution unfold. Then something happened, something powerful enough that this officer looked at the dying man above him and made an extraordinary declaration. But what happened to that centurion afterward? What became of the soldiers who crucified Jesus? Did they simply return to their barracks and disappear from history? Did any of them become followers of the man they had just executed? And can we actually separate what the earliest sources tell us from the legends that appeared centuries later? To answer that, we have to return to Jerusalem, to a city under Roman occupation, and to the final hours before the crucifixion. In the first century, Jerusalem stood inside one of the most politically sensitive regions of the Roman world. Judea had a long religious tradition, a powerful sense of identity, and a complicated relationship with its Roman rulers. Rome did not need every conquered people to abandon their customs. What Rome demanded was something more practical: order. Taxes had to be collected, Roman authority had to be respected, and rebellion had to be crushed. Jerusalem was especially tense during Passover. Thousands of pilgrims could arrive in and around the city. They came to worship and remember the story of Israel's liberation from Egypt. For Roman officials, however, such enormous gatherings also created a security problem. Large crowds could become unpredictable, religious excitement could become political unrest, and Judea had already produced resistance to Roman rule. So soldiers watched Jerusalem carefully. The Roman official at the center of the gospel accounts is Pontius Pilate, the prefect who governed Judea during the period in which Jesus was executed. After Jesus was arrested, the gospel narratives describe him being brought before Pilate. The accusation that mattered most to Rome was political. Jesus was presented as someone claiming kingship, and Rome took claims of rival kingship seriously. Whatever complicated events led to Pilate's decision, the result was unmistakably Roman. Jesus was sentenced to crucifixion, and once that sentence was given, the responsibility passed to Roman soldiers. We do not know their names. That is one of the most important facts in this story. The earliest gospel accounts do not provide a list of the soldiers at the crucifixion. They appear not as famous individuals, but as members of the Roman execution detail. For them, this was part of the machinery of empire. Crucifixion was designed to be slow, humiliating, and public. The condemned person was displayed before everyone. The punishment attacked not only the body, but reputation and dignity. The message was simple: Rome had won. According to the gospel narratives, the soldiers mocked Jesus. They dressed him in a way that ridiculed the accusation that he was a king. A crown of thorns was placed upon him. He was struck. Then he was led away to be crucified. At some point along the journey, Simon of Cyrene was compelled to carry the cross. Eventually, the procession reached the execution site known as Golgotha, and there the soldiers began their work. For centuries, Christian art has imagined this moment in enormous detail. But the gospel writers themselves are remarkably restrained. They do not tell us which soldier held Jesus' arm. They do not tell us who positioned the nail. They do not describe the expression on the executioner's face. They simply tell us that Jesus was crucified, that silence matters. Because everything we imagine beyond the text must be treated carefully. What we can say is that Roman soldiers were responsible for carrying out the execution, and after the cross was raised, they remained there. Their assignment was not finished. The soldiers had another reason to stay. The condemned could not simply be abandoned without supervision. The execution site had to remain under Roman control. According to the Gospel of John, the soldiers divided Jesus' garments among themselves, but one piece of clothing was different. His tunic was woven in one piece. Instead of tearing it, the soldiers cast lots to determine who would receive it. Imagine the contrast. Above them, a man was dying. Around him, people were grieving, and beneath the cross, soldiers were deciding who would take his clothing. To them, it may have seemed completely ordinary, a small benefit attached to a brutal assignment. But to the gospel writer, the moment carried deeper significance, and the soldiers had no idea that their actions would still be discussed almost 2,000 years later. Then the atmosphere around the execution began to change. The Gospels place particular attention on one Roman officer, a centurion. The title is important. A centurion was not simply another soldier. He was an officer with responsibility and experience. This was a man accustomed to military discipline. He lived inside the Roman system of command, and death was unlikely to have been unfamiliar to him. Yet the death of Jesus produced a reaction significant enough to be preserved in the gospel tradition. The gospel accounts describe darkness during the crucifixion. Jesus cried out, and eventually he died. The Gospel of Mark then focuses on the centurion standing opposite him. The officer had been watching. He had seen how Jesus died, and his response became one of the most striking moments in the entire crucifixion narrative. He declared, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." Think about who is saying this. Not one of Jesus' disciples, not one of the people who had followed him through Galilee, not a member of his family, a Roman centurion, a representative of the empire responsible for the execution. Mark begins his gospel by identifying Jesus as the Son of God, and near the moment of Jesus' death, a Roman officer speaks those words. But there is something we need to understand. The gospel accounts do not preserve the centurion's words in exactly the same way. Matthew presents a similar declaration connected with the earthquake and the events surrounding Jesus' death. Luke gives the officer's response differently, describing Jesus as righteous or innocent depending on translation. The details differ. But all three synoptic gospels preserve something remarkable. A Roman centurion responds to Jesus' death with recognition. And that raises the question that has fascinated Christians for centuries. Who was this man? The Bible never tells us his name. Read the crucifixion narratives carefully and you will not find it. The centurion appears at one of the most important moments in Christian history, speaks, and then disappears. There is no biblical account of him meeting the apostles afterward, no description of his baptism, no record of his later life, no explanation of how he died. From the standpoint of the earliest texts, his fate is unknown, but human beings do not like unfinished stories, and over time, tradition gave the anonymous centurion something the Gospels never did: a name, Longinus. This is where history and later Christian tradition begin to separate. The name Longinus does not appear in the New Testament. It emerged in later tradition. And over centuries, different stories developed around a figure called Longinus. In some traditions, he was identified with the centurion who recognized Jesus at the cross. In others, he became associated with the soldier who pierced Jesus' side with a spear in the Gospel of John. But John does not name that soldier either. Later storytelling increasingly connected these anonymous Roman figures. Eventually, Longinus became a Christian saint in several traditions. Stories claimed that he converted. Some said he abandoned military service. Others described him preaching the Christian faith. Still others told of his martyrdom. These stories became powerful parts of Christian memory. But we have to be precise. They are later traditions. They cannot be treated as if they were eyewitness biographies preserved in the New Testament. The historical centurion at the cross may have been called Longinus, or he may not have been. We simply do not know. And strangely, that uncertainty makes the original gospel story even more interesting. Because perhaps the writer did not think his personal name was the important part. What mattered was what he saw and what he said. There was another Roman action at the cross that later became deeply connected with the Longinus tradition. The Gospel of John tells us that the bodies could not remain on the crosses during the coming Sabbath. The soldiers therefore broke the legs of the other crucified men. This would hasten death. But when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead, so they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear. John describes blood and water coming from the wound. Once again, the soldier is anonymous. John does not say, Longinus pierced his side. He says one of the soldiers did it. That distinction is important. Centuries of paintings, icons, and stories can become so familiar that we begin to remember later tradition as though it were written directly in the biblical text. It isn't. We have an unnamed centurion. We have an unnamed soldier with a spear. Later tradition connects them. The earliest text does not explicitly do so, but the soldier's involvement in the story was still not over. After Jesus died, Joseph of Arimathea asked Pilate for the body. Jesus was buried in a tomb. According to the Gospel of Matthew, concerns then arose that Jesus' disciples might steal the body and claim that he had risen. A guard was placed at the tomb. This produces another question. Were these the same soldiers who had been at the crucifixion? The text does not tell us, and there is debate over precisely how the guard should be understood. Matthew describes the tomb being secured and guarded. Then, in the resurrection narrative, the guards experience terrifying events. An earthquake occurs, an angel appears, and the guards become like dead men from fear. Later, Matthew says some of the guard went into the city and reported what had happened. According to Matthew's account, they were then given money and instructed to say that Jesus' disciples had stolen the body while they slept. Again, we should not merge characters simply because it makes a dramatic story. We cannot confidently say that the centurion from Golgotha was standing at the tomb. We cannot say that the soldier who pierced Jesus' side was there either. The sources do not give us that connection. What they do give us is a remarkable pattern. Roman authority appears throughout the final stages of the story. Roman power authorizes the execution. Roman soldiers carry it out. A Roman officer reacts to Jesus' death, and guards become part of Matthew's resurrection narrative. The empire seems to surround the story, and yet it cannot control what happens next. From the perspective of Roman administration, the execution should have ended the problem. Jesus was dead. The public punishment had been carried out. The body had been buried. Rome had executed countless people. Most disappeared from history. But Jesus did not. His followers began proclaiming that he had risen from the dead. The movement spread, first through Jerusalem, then beyond Judea, across the eastern Mediterranean, into cities connected by Roman roads and trade routes, and eventually to Rome itself. This is one of history's great ironies. The empire whose soldiers crucified Jesus later became filled with communities that worshipped him. Christians appeared throughout the Roman world. At times they faced suspicion, local hostility, and imperial persecution. Yet the movement continued growing. And centuries after the crucifixion, Christianity would become deeply connected with the Roman imperial world. The cross itself underwent an extraordinary transformation. It began as an instrument of Roman humiliation. Eventually, it became the most recognizable symbol of Christianity. An empire used the cross to demonstrate power. Christians came to see that same cross as the place where God's power was revealed in an entirely different way. And at the center of the earliest crucifixion story stands an anonymous Roman officer watching. So did the Centurion become a Christian? This is the question everyone wants answered, and the most historically responsible answer is, we don't know. The Centurion's declaration is preserved, his